One of the often forgotten groups of people persecuted by the Nazi regime is homosexuals. From the somewhat open and tolerant Weimar Republic, homosexuals in Germany and the conquered countries faced oppression, criminal conviction, and detention in concentration and death camps. It is thought that some 15,000 homosexual men were sent to concentration camps, with an estimated 3,000 to 9,000 killed or worked to death, forced to wear a pink triangle to single them out as the lowest of the camp population. This symbol has been reclaimed and is now a sign of pride. It is perhaps helpful to start with the situation in Germany before the rise of Nazism. Following defeat in World War I, the period known as the Weimer Republic was seen as a progressive and safe time for homosexuals. Whilst there were the usual sodomy laws banning relationships between men, the laws were not often enforced. Activist and lawyer Karl-Heinrich Ulrichs had paved the way for the laws to be relaxed and for a more open approach to homosexuality. The Institute for Sexual Research was established by Magnus Hirschfeld, a Jewish and homosexual doctor who led early research into the biological and nature of homosexuality. Plays featuring homosexual protagonist and lesbian masquerade balls saw the emergence of an open gay community. Whilst homophobia still existed, the Weimar government did not actively oppress homosexuals, and reportedly considered repealing part of the laws oppressing them. But the rise of Nazism saw an end to this state of affairs. One of Nazism's key tenets was the preservation and expansion of the Aryan race. Homosexuality in men was therefore seen as a direct threat to this, as well as being seen as degenerate immoral behaviours. It was not merely a criminal act to be punished, but a racial betrayal that could not be tolerated. Lesbians were not seen in such a way by the National Socialists, as female sexuality was not seen as a real thing. It was expected that any woman could play her part in producing offspring regardless, with force if needed. Children and the creation of more children was a key tenet of Nazism and its long-term survival. However, in the following prosecution of homosexual men, homosexual women too would lose out. Once in power, the Nazis immediately sought to close and destroy any gay bar, club or organisation. On the 6th of May 1933, the Institute for Sexual Research was destroyed, with members of the Nazi paramilitary SA and students carrying out a book burning and ransacking the building. Homosexual newspapers and journals were banned as gay men became targets of arrests. Many homosexual organisations set about destroying their membership records and dissolving, understanding the real dangers. Whilst there were clear homophobic leaders within the Nazi government, such as Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, there is one notable example who was not: Ernst Röhm. Ernst Röhm was head of the paramilitary SA and was a homosexual, although he would not describe himself as one. He was more concerned with the ridiculous prudery of some of his fellow Nazi leaders and encouraging an overthrow of conventional morality. His paramilitary was seen as a threat to the German establishment, whilst Röhm's revolutionary ambitions painted him as a target by other Nazi leaders. During the Night of the Long Knives, Röhm was executed on Hitler's orders. Röhm's homosexuality was an open secret and was used as part of the justification for his elimination. Following the reduction in the role of the SA, Himmler's SS was on the rise, having played a key role in the Night of the Long Knives. The Night of the Long Knives was essentially a day where Hitler executed many of his political enemies, with many of them actually being part of the Nazi regime. Himmler played a key role in the Night of the Long Knives, and his organisation, the SS, expanded their control and reach over Germany. Himmler, along with his second-in-command, Reinhard Heydrich, along with his secret police force, the Gestapo, set about compiling the Pink Lists. Names of suspected and convicted homosexual men were drafted. By 1934, arrests of gay men increased, as did raids against clubs and bars. Those arrested would often plead guilty to acts not covered by the penal code, hoping to avoid punishment, though this would not work. In 1935, the Nazis revised part of previous laws, increasing the range. No longer would homosexual acts be needed. The mere homosexual desire between two men was enough to be arrested. Some men were convicted under this new law for embracing or for other mundane acts that were seen by the Nazis as degenerate. Simply dressing in a way considered different was enough. This expansion also covered those who did not adhere to gender norms. The following year saw the peak in arrests of gay men by the Nazis. There was a shift in targeting individuals and encouraging the German public to denounce those they suspected of homosexual acts. Of the 100,000 people arrested, it is thought that a third of arrests came following a denunciation. Whether it was a disgruntled neighbour or colleague, a homophobic meddler, or a loyal Nazi, many were arrested by such accusations. Sometimes the accusation could be as simple as the way the person walked, dressed, or a feeling that they were different. Those who accused lesbians, however, often found their denunciations led nowhere. The police had no legal basis to arrest lesbians, and therefore they were unable to act further. For those who were arrested, torture and abuse would be levelled against the condemned, as to extract information of their partners. Through these methods, the Nazis were able to gather up large numbers of connected men. Also, in 1936, Himmler set up the Reich Central Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion. These two acts were seen as the greatest threat for the expansion of the Aryan population, and so the Nazis devoted an office to its eradication. It would gather intelligence and data whilst coordinating actions against homosexuals. Once imprisoned, the Nazis would encourage gay men to consent to castration in exchange for an early release. Castration was previously a punishment reserved for serious sexual offenders and those that target children. However, the Nazis expanded its use against gay men. Sometimes the threat of being sent to a concentration camp if the prisoner did not agree to castration was enough. Often this encouragement would be in the form of horrendous treatment, torture, and conditions. Soon enough, the concentration camps were given the authority to forcibly castrate prisoners. Some of those arrested would end up within the criminal prisons, but some, the ones deemed to be repeat offenders, would end up in the country's growing concentration camp network. Such prisoners were sent under the typical Nazi euphemistic term of protective custody. Within these camps, prisoners were labelled, made to wear some form of insignia to allow the guards to better understand the crimes of the prisoner. For Jews, it would be the infamous Yellow Star of David. For communists and political prisoners, it was the Red Triangle, and for homosexuals, it was the Pink Triangle. This singled out gay men as the lowest rank of prisoner within the camp. Other prisoners often stayed well clear, unwilling to show solidarity for fear of reprisal or due to their own homophobia. Those wearing pink triangles were often targets of SA by both the guards and other prisoners. Often, those wearing pink triangles were given the harshest work details and the worst sleeping quarters. At camps such as Flossenburg, it was policy to work homosexual prisoners to death. Other methods of curing homosexuality was to force the men to have sex with Roma or Jewish women, forced into prostitution by the camps, and often with the guards secretly watching. Those gay men considered to have been cured were forced to join one of the SS divisions, including the notorious Dollfanger Brigade. As a way to prevent any self-pleasure, the guards would insist that the prisoners keep their hands outside of their sheets, a difficult prospect in the freezing cold nights. Any prisoner caught disobeying would be taken outside in the night and would have cold water poured all over them. Sachsenhausen held a large number of homosexual prisoners working in the horrendous cement and brick plants. Commandant Rudolf Höss, who would later be sent to run Auschwitz, believed that hard labour would re-educate gay men and remove their homosexuality. As previously alluded to, lesbians were rarely persecuted on account of being lesbians. However, plenty of lesbians ended up in the camps on account of being some other category of prisoner, such as Jewish, Roma, or communist. Sometimes creative or outright fabricated reasons would be used to imprison lesbians into the camps. One notable example is that of Eli Schmuller and Marguerite Rosenberg. The two worked for the Berlin Transport Authority and were denounced for their lesbian relationship, as there were no laws against such relationships, and with the Gestapo unwilling to close the case, the two were instead sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp for subversive conduct. They were held to be engaging in conduct that affected the running of the tram system due to the alcohol consumed at the parties the two hosted. They were not marked with the pink triangle of homosexuals, rather the red triangle of political prisoners, although their internment documentation made reference to them being lesbians. Schmuller died in 1943, whilst Rosenberg survived 4 years in the camps. Many prisoners in the concentration camps would end up forced into all manner of human experimentation, with homosexuals often preferred as unwilling subjects. One of the more infamous experiments was carried out by Dr. Karl Warnert. He attempted to change the sexuality of a group of homosexual men. He surgically implanted them with a capsule, and this capsule would release testosterone. It is known that 2 of the victims died, but there is no record as to the fate of the rest. Some men were even intentionally infected with typhus, as to see how it affected the human body. It is thought that anywhere from 3,000 to 9,000 homosexuals were murdered in the camps. In face of rising persecution, gay men within Germany faced a choice as to how they would deal with the dangerous situation. In the early years, some who could fled to neighbouring countries. Others would cut ties off to their community or enter into marriages of convenience to hide their sexuality, sometimes with lesbian women. Some continued, but in an underground secretive fashion, ever knowing the risks of denunciations. Some would go on to join resistance movements against the Nazis. One notable example of the latter was Willem Arrendus, a Dutch author who joined the resistance when his country was invaded by the Nazis. He was a leading member of a movement that provided forged identification cards to allow Jews and other targets evade capture. Willem worked closely with other prominent artists in creating these forgeries. The group would go on to target a records office, destroying over 800,000 records. The group was eventually captured, though Willem did refuse to betray his compatriots, insisting he was solely responsible, something that likely led to the release of 2 of his group. On the 1st of July 1943, Willem was executed by firing squad, with his last words reportedly being, "Tell people that homosexuals are not cowards." As the war progressed, the Nazis were faced with manpower shortages for the military. Despite the repression and persecution of gay men, the Nazis started to conscript them into the armed forces. Even those who had been imprisoned in concentration camps and those who had been castrated were forced into the military service. When the Nazis were defeated and the camps liberated, many of the homosexual prisoners were freed, but for some the experience was not as smooth as one might think. For starters, the laws responsible for arresting homosexual men was kept in the German Penal Code. The very basis for imprisoning gay men would remain in place until the late 1960s. From the end of World War II until the removal of this law, some 50,000 men were convicted. The law responsible for their imprisonment was known as Part 175, where prisoners had been sentenced under 175 but had served part of their sentence in a concentration camp. The American and British lawyers dealing with the post-war administration argued that these men should complete their sentences in conventional prisons. For example, if a man had been sentenced to 10 years in prison and had served 5 in prison and 5 in a death camp, he would be expected to serve another 5 years in prison to complete his sentence. Most prisoners were awarded some level of compensation, but homosexuals were included from any payments as they were actually considered to be criminals. Once liberated, many former prisoners would detail their horrific experiences. For homosexuals, continuing homophobia made this difficult, if not impossible. Many refused to detail their experiences, attempting to reintegrate into society. Many destroyed what records or documents they held, including destroying the pink triangle they were forced to wear. One of the few accounts of a homosexual survivor has been written, a book by the name of The Men with the Pink Triangle by Heinz Heger. It would not be until 1985 that homosexuals were first recognized by West Germany as victims of Nazism. For the 40th anniversary, Federal President Richard von Weizsäcker listed many victims of the Nazi regime, mentioning homosexuals. It was only in 2002 where all convictions under Section 175 were finally overturned, but a further 15 years for any compensation for homosexual victims. A number of memorials have been created to commemorate the homosexual victims of the Nazi regime. The pink triangle is now a symbol of gay pride, notably used in opposition in examples of systematic oppression. The victims of the Nazi regime are many. Whilst homosexuals may not be a numerically large group of victims compared to others, they are an important one. The destruction of homosexual communities and lives by the Nazis ought to never be forgotten, as it is a disturbing example of the dangers of dehumanizing a group of people.